Anyway, I'll get started. Hello, everybody on Zoom. I'm Greg Noble, if you don't know me, and I'm going to be talking about Pierre Bourdieu. That's the introduction. No one's here to introduce me, so that's it. Okay. Do I have qualifications for talking about Bourdieu? Well, I've been struggling with him for probably 35 odd years. I reckon about the time I retire, I might just about have got it. But at the moment, I'm still struggling. So why should we talk about Bourdieu? He's obviously a key thinker of our times. He is, by some measures, one of the most cited scholars of all time in the humanities and social sciences. If that's not enough, citations aren't enough to convince you. Many of his tools have become key cultural theoretical tools, like cultural capital, which we're going to be talking about, and used and abused broadly. But a few caveats. The first is that Bourdieu is very difficult. He's difficult for many number of reasons, but not least because he's dealing with difficult ideas. There are other reasons as well, but that's the most important one. I'm going to focus on the three main ideas today: capital, field, and habitus. My original plan was to do two sessions with you, one kind of working through the basics of Bourdieu, and the other one to do an extended empirical analysis, exploring some of his ideas. Apparently that was not voted for, so the second bit will be very, very limited. I'll have a few examples along the way, but mostly it's just going to be working through the ideas, the key ideas. There'll be many ideas that I actually won't get around to today because it's so he says so much. So the other caveat is that this is my take on Bourdieu, and there are many, many different takes on any theorist. Any given theorist, there'll be various versions of how to use and how to understand the key ideas. Mine is peculiar in some ways, but I'll try and give you a fairly standard kind of idea of Bourdieu, and you'll see the points of difference, particularly when I critique what I see as the sloppy and lazy uses of Bourdieu. So the format will be this. I'll work my way through the three key conceptual ideas and throw in a few other things along the way. Each little section will have a discussion of first of all, I'll start with the kind of a bio context. I'll work through each of the key ideas, giving something like a definition, although a definition in Bourdieu is always a little bit of a challenge to find. I'll give a few examples, but nothing too profound or deep. And then I'll offer a series of criticisms, or what I refer to as good problems. Okay. And the last caveat that I'll make, and I'll make this again later on, is that I'm going to be presenting Bourdieu as a theorist, and that's the very nature of what we're doing. But Bourdieu insists time and time again that he's not a theorist, that in fact his ideas, and I'll show you some comments of his later on, are essentially about engaging with empirical work, emerge out of empirical work, and are refined in the course of various kinds of empirical projects. Sometimes when you read him, it's hard to see him as an empirical researcher, but he insists upon that. So let's start. As you will know, Bourdieu was a French sociologist with a background in anthropology and philosophy, whose central contribution is seen to be in terms of our understanding of the relations between culture, power, and social order, through his analysis of the links between what he calls cultural and social capitals, habitus in field, in works such as Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste, Outline of a theory of practice, and many, many, many others. He's a leading figure in what could loosely be called practice theory, though he is often dismissed as being very deterministic, which is intentional. He wrote across many disciplines and across many topics: colonialism, peasant societies, art, literature, and wider cultural fields, the state, intellectuals, academia, gender and class, sport, fashion, and so on and so forth. He has enormous corpus. Now, interestingly, Bourdieu is, oh, okay. Oh, yes, so the second one. Okay. That's interesting. There we go. Okay, so interestingly, Bourdieu is actually.
Shall we minimize that?
Oh, yeah. Is that?
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. He's born of fairly humble origins. He's born in Donguin, a rural area in near Bienne, in the Pyrenees, in southwest France. His father is basically from a peasant or a sharecropping family, although he eventually becomes a postman and then a postal worker. Okay. Bourdieu's mother is actually from a landowning peasant family. Okay, so they've got a bit of property, but they're not prestigious family. How he becomes an esteemed professor working in an esteemed institution, we call it de France, is a kind of interesting trajectory in its own right. And he discusses it at length in a book called Sketch for a Social Analysis. I don't think very convincingly, but then he would probably accept that that's the nature of trying to do that kind of work. But that kind of trajectory, even though it's relatively important to thinking about the questions that he asks in relationship to cultural capital and field and so on, his life is not the focus of today's talk. But briefly, it's interesting that he goes from his local school in his little rural area to a boarding school at a lycée in the nearest big town. Then he gets a scholarship to a prestige school in Paris. Then he goes to a prestigious école, but he refuses to do a thesis, briefly becomes a teacher, gets conscripted into the army and serves in the colonial government in Algeria during the War of Independence, where he becomes radicalised, then gains a series of and writes about his Algerian experience, then takes up a series of posts in minor universities and eventually gets a position at the prestigious Collège de France. So it's a really interesting history, and it kind of goes against what some people would read as his arguments about the reproduction of positions of class and power through forms of cultural capital. He seems to be the exception. And it's something that I grappled with Megan Watkins in a paper called So How Do Bourdieu Learn to Play Tennis 20 years ago. But interestingly, Bourdieu always actually saw himself as a kind of an outsider as a result, and he dwells a lot on that, and I think it actually informs some of his ideas. So apart from his family history, there are three other aspects of his context that I want to talk about. The first I mentioned already, the experience of working in the colonial government during the Algerian War of Independence, which transforms him, radicalises him, also gives him access to a library where he spends a lot of time reading rather than oppressing the natives. He actually stays in Algeria, does a lot of field work and writes it up and publishes it. The second context is working in post-war France, where the figure of Jean-Paul Sartre and the idea of the committed intellectual dominates the world of academia. He's particularly in the 1960s with the growth of student radicalism. Bourdieu often spends much of his time thinking about the nature of intellectual practice, the politics of intellectual practice, and its place in it. And the third very important aspect of that context is, as some of you will know, been in my classes before, is that academics constantly are in debates with each other. They just sometimes don't tell you who is. Okay, so in the readings that I've given you today, he's actually been a bit more explicit about what he's arguing against. But often there are lots of little kind of digs at particular writers and approaches and positioning his work in relationship to that. But that becomes very important in understanding his particular approach to practice. But his work often involves building on, but also critiquing broad schools of structuralism, Marxism, phenomenology, existentialism, and rational choice theory, kind of the basis of liberal economic theory. And very specifically, the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Max Weber, Durkheim, Marcel Mauss, and many others. And his conceptual framework is clearly framed by the tensions between these various approaches, as well as drawing from them. I want to start, before I talk about the three big ideas, just simply this, that out of that kind of context of working with those different approaches and arguing against them and with them and so on, he develops his theory of practice. So even though Bourdieu is often accused of being very deterministic and very structuralist, he sees his work as primarily developing a theory of practice or an approach to the study of practice whose central concern is to explain practice or agency without falling into the traps of what he calls structuralism and objectivism. And he actually has a whole range of other names along the way, which we'll talk to about, substantialism and so on. And he sees what he does is what he calls as a kind of a generative structuralism. Okay, and he uses the concepts of capital field and habitus to explore the structural conditioning of practices and the way practice is involved in the construction and reconstruction of the worlds people live in. Okay. So it's that relationship between objective structures and the cognitive and motivating structures. And I've underlined that second use of structures because he doesn't actually mean structure in the way he means it in the first sense. It's really about the habitus, for example. That's a kind of a structure. Okay? So let's start with his discussion about capitals. I've given you one of his simplest readings, I think. And hopefully it was relatively simple. His discussion of the idea of capital. And he argues, alongside the language of economic capital, which is well established, that we need to talk about cultural and social capital in particular, and then there's another category of symbolic capital. So he applies a language that's drawn from economics to cultural and social life. It's quite controversial for some people. But by capital, he broadly means particular kinds of resources, assets, competencies, skills, qualifications, which enable their holders to be positioned and to participate in and participate effectively in a particular social domain. It's not just a kind of a broad, flat sense of resources. We'll come back to that later on. It's a critical one about how it's situated in a particular place. So why capital? Like economic capital, Bourdieu argues that cultural and social capitals are accumulated. Okay? They take time. Bourdieu has a big thing about time in books like Outline of a Theory of Practice. He says time is really, really important. And that's partly because so much social theory in the social sciences starts with people as though they're just already been socialised without talking about the socialisation. They are just agents who are working in the social world. So time is really important. And talks about capital, cultural capital being accumulated. But he also uses the language of markets. He talks about cultural markets, how we invest in those markets, how we convert our capitals into other things, how we gain profits from those resources. But he's not doing it in a way to simply reduce it to economics. He's actually using it against economics, and particularly rational action theory, rational choice theory. That was the central argument in economic theory at that time. So let's kind of talk about a few of them, which is captured in the reading I've given you. So cultural capital, firstly, what you know, what you do, what you can do. And he talks about existing in three forms: institutionalized, as in qualifications, objective, as in goods, and embodied, as in dispositions of a mind and body, things like language, accent, mannerisms, aesthetic preferences, bearing and demeanour. If we think about, I'm going to focus on embodied a bit later on, but if we think of the most professory person you know, the most professory professor that you've come across, and just think about that professor bearing themselves in a particular way, acting in a particular way. Okay? That's that kind of embodied cultural capital. I think that's the most interesting of the three. Institutionalised is relatively straightforward. I'm just going to show you a picture first. That's the corner of my study at home. Okay, have I got cultural capital? In the bucket loads. So you can see, for example, right at the top there, I've got qualifications. Yeah, they're mine and my father's, okay, because family is very important to the acquisition of cultural capital. Okay, not that you go to university, we're accountancy diplomas. So you've got the first level of institutionalized cultural capital that you there. Then you've got the cultural goods of books, a really important kind of cultural capital for us academics. Okay, you can't see the embodied cultural capital. Why not? There's no body there. I'm not standing there. Okay, but if you think about it, to read those books, for example, and to talk about them, you require embodied cultural capital. Okay, that's a very quick gloss on the ideas. What Bourdieu does with notions of capital is actually quite interesting, because as I said, he doesn't see it just as a kind of a flat resource, as a kind of a simple bunch of things that you have. He talks about it at length in various ways, but particularly the way the distribution of capital is a structuring principle of a field. Okay, if you think of any field, universities, field of higher education, the distribution of capital, as a professor, presumably I have a lot. As students, you don't have quite so much as me. So important to a field is the distribution of the capital. It's not just having particular books or a lot of books. It's a volume and composition of cultural capital that's important. So you can look at my picture and say, well, the books are really important cultural capital, but to the right, the football jersey or the guitar down below may not be so important, depending on the perspective. We'll come to the question of cultural hierarchies in a second. But really crucial to his arguments about the cultural capital is the return to the idea of the market. Now, we all recognise pretty well, I think, that cultural goods are symbolic goods that function because they have value. Okay? But they have value because of the principle of scarcity. If everybody has the same amount of cultural capital, it has no consequences. So cultural capital has to be distributed, and has to be distributed evenly, unevenly, to have a particular kind of role in the organisation of the field. In other words, it has to be in a marketplace where the profits from having a lot of good cultural capital can be realised. And so getting a job in university is the profits realised from having a lot of cultural capital.
And so it's made difficult deliberately.
Sorry?
So it is made difficult deliberately because of the principle of scarcity.
Yes. Yeah. And I'll just say, because we've got so many people on Zoom, I was going to take questions as we went along, but there aren't so many people here, so I'm just going to go and finish, and then we'll worry about what happens, and I'll see what happens on Zoom. The other important thing about cultural capital is that there has to be mechanisms of recognition. It's no good having what you think is cultural capital that's not recognised by anybody. Okay? And by those mechanisms of recognition, the fundamental primary one is the state. The state always has a role in the recognition of things like qualifications. Okay? It oversees that process. But so too does each field have its, its gatekeepers. Academics who supervise students' theses and mark them and accept them or don't. Okay? So there are mechanisms of recognition built into any given field. I'll talk about field in a second, for the valuing and the use of capital. But we also must have kind of everyday forms of recognition. Okay, if I walk into a pub in Edmonton and say, I've read the entire works of Shakespeare, if nobody there thinks it's particularly valuable in that particular context, it's not valuable. Okay? So recognition is really important, and we'll come to its corollary a bit later of misrecognition. So distinction is the book par excellence, where he explores issues of cultural goods in particular, cultural tastes in relationship to an argument about cultural capital. He also talks about that in relationship to field and habitus, but distinction is this amazing enormous exercise where he maps the tastes of the French public. And unsurprisingly, he finds in the 1960s there's a very strong link between economic capital and cultural capital. And that sustains the thesis that cultural capital is important in the reproduction of relations of power. But, and there's a really big but, it's not a simple or direct relationship. What he shows is that economic capital and cultural capital operate as different axes of power. Okay? And by that he means you can be economically successful and not necessarily have a lot of cultural capital. You can be have a lot of cultural capital, like a professor, and you might be middle class, but you're never going to be a billionaire on the basis of being a professor. Yeah? So the place of cultural capital in relationship to large relations of power can be mapped in terms of these competing axes of capital, economic versus cultural capital. And he makes the point that all capitals are convertible into other capitals, but not automatically or always easily. Okay, so if I happen to be a rich guy, I could buy myself a whole lot of books, put them on a shelf, and then get a few diplomas from the University of blah 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 in some obscure place, and I could present myself as having lots of cultural capital. But in fact, I can't act in the world as though I actually have that culture. So conversion is a much more complicated process than simply buying the goods that seem to represent status or power. So what Bourdieu is trying to do is to offer a more complicated and mediated form of understanding the relationships between class and power through notions of cultural and social capital. Now, the interesting thing about what he then does with his arguments about cultural capital is to explore particularly the role of education. And from the almost the beginning of his career, he spends a lot of time analysing educational systems in 4 or 5 books, I think. And what he argues in that is that the way cultural capital works in relationship to power is that schools function to legitimise systems of cultural value, and indeed hierarchies of culture that are already distributed amongst the population. So middle class kids and ruling class kids go on to school and have their culture validated and presented to them as the truths of the world, as the important things to know about the world, whereas working class kids, because he's primarily talking about class, go on to the world and don't see the things that they value there. Okay, so schools, and this is a difficult idea for us, I'll come back to it in a second, because schools represent the possibility of social hope, the trajectory out of poverty, as well as a system of social reproduction. So cultural education in schools operate to validate and reproduce the cultural capital of what he calls the dominant. He tends to use language like dominant and dominated rather than class. And if we get time, we'll come back to that, but we probably won't. So schooling reproduces the value, the cultural values behind cultural capital, as well as shaping the distribution, and largely affirms the already existing cultural hierarchies. Well, that's true today in another country. You can think about that. Now, since he wrote about cultural capital, which is called sometimes informational capital, he also talked about a whole range of other capitals, such as juridical, academic, political, religious, and so on. We don't have time to really talk about those. I want to skip to briefly talk about the other key forms of that he talks about in the forms of capital. So social capital is simply who you know, that it's the sum of the resources that accrue to an individual by virtue of possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalised relationships of acquaintance and recognition. Now, his use of capital here, both in cultural capital and social capital, is not the same as human capital theories. It's not the same as social capital as used by people like Coleman and Putnam. It's about a relational, critical understanding of capital and the way it functions in terms of questions of power. Social capital is relatively straightforward. He actually doesn't talk that much really in the end about social capital because it's relatively straightforward. And if you read the newspaper on any given day, you'll see that some kids who went to the same private school are in the same businesses doing the same dodgy deals week in, week out. Private schooling is simply the most elite private schooling is simply the most obvious way of thinking about the idea of social capital. And he actually has written a whole book called State Nobility, which explores how elites get reproduced both in terms of culture and social capital. Symbolic capital, I prefer it when he actually talks about this. At one point or several points, he actually says, rather than call it symbolic capital, it's actually the symbolic or symbolized forms of capital. And what he means by that is that sometimes we operate with capital and it gets misrecognized. So rather than see it as the conditions of existence that produce capital, it's construed as honor or prestige, okay? So I'm a really good person. That's how I got to where I am, through hard work and dedication and strong values. It's not because I came from a privileged position. So it's a misrecognition of the conditions which produce the inequalities of the distribution of cultural capital. And he talks a lot, honour is a very key idea in anthropology. And so he talks a lot about the role of honour in particular as a kind of a misrecognised category, where we misrecognise the conditions of the production of capital and see it as a kind of attribute of character, self-worth. Okay, and they're very important, but I want to kind of very briefly talk about some of the problems with these notions of capitals. And I talk about these as good problems. I always think problems are always good. They're not just criticisms which mean you reject a theory. They're problems that are useful to think with. The first one is, particularly given that Bourdieu is talking about culture in France in the 1960s in distinction, he's operating with a particular understanding of cultural hierarchy, which tends to be fairly singular. Okay. Since then, people will talk about the proliferation of subcultures, and that all cultures are equally worthy, and we should honour everything. But so some people find his idea of cultural hierarchy quite challenging and unacceptable even. But what he's trying to show is when you look at the distribution of forms of power in relationship to forms of cultural capital, there is clearly a cultural hierarchy, he says. Related to that is his idea of the cultural arbitrary. And he argues that cultural capital is always predicated on an idea of what's valuable, which is a completely arbitrary idea. So the hierarchy idea and the arbitrary idea actually kind of go together quite neatly. And there might be good reasons for arguing why some cultural item that's valued currently is actually just an arbitrary thing. It doesn't really matter whether it's this book or that book. It's actually what gets seen to be valued by the people that operate in a particular space or field. I think that's a problem though, because there are some forms of cultural capital which are what another sociologist called Roy Nash refers to as socially necessary. So literacy is a really good example. I don't think it helps to see literacy as purely an arbitrary cultural value. It actually is a socially efficacious set of resources and skills which allow people to participate in the world, yes, but also do other things as well. So but they kind of ask us to think, so what is the place of hierarchy? What is the place of the value? So you've probably been aware that there's been in education, there's been lots of arguments about should we be teaching Shakespeare anymore? Let's teach young children's adults novels about, identity and falling in love and falling out of love and having drugs and not having drugs and pop music. Are they of equal value? It also has very practical kind of consequences. So if we see schools primarily as reproducing relations of power through cultural capital, where does that leave our arguments about the role of schooling in terms of social mobility and whether they can actually challenge or change those hierarchies? Bourdieu would probably argue something like the content of what is valued can change in schools. But what we've seen even over the last 50 years is that the structure of inequality doesn't change. So this is where his idea of the arbitrary actually kind of kicks in. It doesn't really matter what gets reproduced in a sense, because people with cultural capital and power and people without still get reproduced as a particular kind of relationship. It does challenge our idea that schooling is a form of meritocracy, that you get there on your basis of your talent. And it does challenge the idea that education can be a flattening process, giving everybody an equal chance. More kind of interesting problems about how, since he wrote this book, people have put the word capital after a whole bunch of other adjectives. So everybody has produced their own capital. And I've seen some pretty awful ones, okay? Examination capital, for example, I don't know what that means. Multicultural capital, I'm not sure what that means either. And you can see what people are trying to get at in a sense, but it doesn't work in a Bourdieusian sense. All they're doing is saying, this is a particular resource, it's good, therefore it's a capital. That's not what Bourdieu meant. Yeah? He has a much more critical understanding of the place of capital. So the good problem is because I make us think about, when does a resource become a capital? Where does it become a capital? How does it become a capital? What mechanisms of recognition are in place for that resource to be considered and function as a capital? What practices of conversion enable people to turn their resources into other kinds of social profits? The question of acquisition, which I'll come back to right at the end, it's one that interests me. And how does the distribution, the volume and the composition of capitals change? Which is something that Bourdieu is interested in, but doesn't explore in the kinds of empirical ways that I think would be interesting. So there are a bunch of questions that are interesting for us as we work through the ideas of social capital. But as I said, people often use the idea of a capital fairly badly as a kind of a flat idea. It's a resource that you have, and people have it, people don't have it, blah, 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 that you can kind of do a stock taking of or an audit of some sort. You've got 14 of them, I've got 12, so on and so forth. And Bourdieu doesn't mean capital that way. In fact, he also refers to capital as a kind of social energy. It's a really interesting idea, because what it does is it takes us away from the stock taking idea of capital and pushes us towards his other ideas of field and habitus. Cultural capital is a kind of energy which allows us to participate at particular places. So let's go with field first. And again, here's my gloss on his various definitions, because he has about 47 of them, and they're never quite a definition as such. But I gloss from him field as a particular kind of social space marked by institutions, agents and their positions, practices and beliefs which embody a certain coherence because they are structured around the same interests, states, capital and ways of being, doing. Okay. Now, it's important to note that Bourdieu starts thinking about field partly in relationship to his own experience of his career in what he refers to as the scholastic hierarchy of French academia, which he refers to as a closed world with a very specific esprit de corps. And so you can see the kind of the formations of ideas of field and cultural capital and so on in the way he thinks about his own experiences in Sketch for Social Analysis. Field works very clearly when you talk about things that we already think of as fields, like a professional field, okay? Or the artistic field. It kind of works there. But Bourdieu is clear that it's not simply an empirically given space. The field is not simply an empirically given space. Okay? And I'll talk about that in a particular way. But if you think about field, it can be used to refer to a meadow, a sports field, a battlefield, and a field of gravitational forces. And in fact, Bourdieu uses all those metaphors when he talks about social fields. Okay? And he does use them for various different reasons, which is why there's not quite one easy definition. And he talks about a whole range of fields in the course of his work. Oh, and there's a list of some that I came across when I was just doing a quick check. Okay, so and some of those we recognise, some of them are not quite so obvious, and some do different kinds of things. So here's the crunch. So I said that Bourdieu doesn't see the field as an empirically given thing, an objective reality. What he says is that field is a kind of a heuristic device to shape the process of research. Field is a construct that we have to try and make sense of how practices and institutions and positions within a particular space seem to work in relationship to each other. Okay? So it's not an empirically objective thing. That's not to say that there aren't things that aren't objective. He says, yes, there are, objectively, there are institutions and certain types of things, but field is a device, a construct to help us to understand this. Okay? So he runs through a various number of ideas about fields, which are important for us. So a field is both relatively autonomous, and yet it's always structured by larger relations of power and legitimation, particularly the role of the state. And in fact, all fields actually also operate in what he calls the field of power. But we won't go there. But it's important to stress that there are mechanisms of recognition and legitimation alongside the degree of autonomy. Universities, again, a relatively good point. Example, we have a degree of autonomy in what we do, and yet we don't. Because we are fundamentally, our space is fundamentally structured by what government policy decides. So he talks about fields in a number of ways. He talks about them in the kind of language of physics, forces of attraction and repulsion. Okay, so this is crucial to his idea of a field as a kind of abstraction of the world, is that it's a relational space. Things only operate in a field because they're related to other things. He talks about his sociology as being a relational sociology because it's predicated on the idea that every institution, every position exists only in relationship to everything else in the field. So to understand an institution or a space or an agent or a practice, you have to understand that relation. Also central to the idea of the field is that this question of the states that are central to a field, what we might refer to as, property capital and other circumstances, the specific capital of the field, that there's always something at stake. So again, at universities, an academic job, PhD, that's at stake, and we are after the states. So a field is defined by the states. It's also defined by the modes of struggle. And by that, he means that there's always a struggle going on to define what is of value in a field. So again, if you think of, say, the artistic field, there's a constant battle of saying, oh, this is the best artwork, and that's rubbish, and so on and so forth. So fields are always places of struggle, like a battlefield, over what's important. They're also a struggle over what's in the field and what's outside the field. Okay? And that, I'll give you an example of that in a second as to why that becomes quite important. So, so he insists that field is useful because it's actually about constructing the research object and trying to make sense of a particular set of practices and institutions. So the question is, how does Bourdieu construct the field? Well, he does it a couple of ways. So in distinction, he does a large-scale survey of consumption practices, okay? In the field of cultural production, he basically reads extensively and of the history of art and puts something together. Homo academicus, he reads archives, journal editorial boards, various documents to kind of construct a picture of what's in the field. And you end up with these different kinds of images. Okay? And you get lots of these images in Bourdieu, and they're mostly almost incomprehensible. Okay? Now, this one looks like it's a pretty scientific kind of thing going on here, but he's basically just made it up, as far as I can see. He's read a lot about French literature, the history of French literature, and he's constructed a kind of a mapping of what he thinks are the kinds of key forces, genres, relations, styles, institutions in the space called the literary field. Okay? In contrast, so bear that in mind, I'll come back to that in a second. In contrast, we've got this in distinction, which is harder to read, but it's actually based on statistical analysis. Something called various forms of statistical analysis, in this case, multiple correspondence analysis, which we're not going to spend any time talking about, thankfully. But basically, it's a software program that turns survey responses into patterns of similarity and difference. And what it means basically is on this particular space, it represents, if you like Mozart and Picasso and jazz, and there are a lot of other people who like Mozart, Picasso and jazz, they'll all be located in the same space. If you like rap, or well, it won't be rap like this, of course. If you like, Hollywood musicals and cheap romance novels and whatever, you won't be anywhere near the people who like Mozart and blah, blah, blah. So the software program produces patterns of likeness and unlikeness in tastes. So you get these complex mappings of taste. Recently, Tony Bennett and the whole cast of thousands, partly from the Institute, have done their own version of that for Australia, Australian Cultural Fields Project, a book called Fields, Capitals, Habitus, where we've actually done the same kind of process, turned people's responses into these kind of complicated maps. And so this is kind of based on data which produces these patterns. And in distinction, as I said, he shows the correlation between these forms of cultural capital in particular fields and questions of power understood in terms of things like class and status. But you get these kind of interesting maps. Now, again, we've got some good problems here. So Bourdieu is not only trying to map a field as though it's objectively given, he's trying to see it. He's trying to construct an object to make sense of it, okay? So the field is a method. It's not an idea born of reality. It's a method for constructing a research object and seeing what goes on in a particular space. Which means that we have to ask, so what exactly is being mapped? Okay? And if you look at his diagrams, you get all sorts of things going on. As I showed you in that one, you had artists, genres, styles, institutions, all thrown together. Okay? But he's trying to see it. But it also begs the question of how is it defined? How do you select what goes in it? Now that's an interesting question for me, because if you take something like getting into cultural fields, the field of theatre, okay, if somebody wants to kind of give a little map of what's important in the field of theatre in Australia, they'll say the Sydney Theatre Company and blah, 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 blah. But do they talk about community theatre that happens in suburban churches? No. So the question of what gets selected in the field as an object of interest actually is part of the process of defining the field. Secondly, how you get to be in the field actually has to come through a mechanism. Very few people end up at the Sydney Theatre Company straight from school. Okay, so how do you get there? You do your pay your dues by working in community theatre and radical theatre and so on and so forth. So all the stuff that's not included in the field actually has an important part to play in the field. It's just not mapped. Okay, so there are all sorts of issues around the definition of the field, which are actually methodologically interesting, but also to tell us something about questions of power, what is seen in the field by the researcher and by the participants. And there are a whole bunch of other questions that follow from that. What's at stake in the field? What's are the rewards? what are the principles of opposition that operate in the field, such as community versus professional, high art versus low art, and what's going on in the organisation of that space. The problem for us in terms of field is that actually society is made up of a multiplicity of fields. So how do these fields all fit together? And that's a really complicated question. That's why he talks about the field of power. And he also talks about something called the social space of lifestyles, okay, as a way of trying to pull these things together. But the more you kind of aggregate, the less fine-tuned your kinds of indications of the relations are. But it's an interesting problem. But it's a problem for you because we all operate with an idea of context, whether we call it field or not, we all operate with the idea of context for the research that we're doing. And the question for us is, so how do you construct the context? Most of us take it for granted. Yes, I'm doing some research on accountancy in Australia. Take accountancy for granted. I'm doing research on libraries in Australia. Take the idea of there being a space called libraries. But what gets included, what gets excluded from their study is actually a research choice that you're making. So Bourdieu makes us think about field. Interestingly, he also talks about field as a space of possibles. But it's not a simple position that one has. Your position is also shaped by your trajectory in the field. And we can't talk about that in any detail here. But what it says is that a field is not a series of static positions. We're all in movement. But the reason I like the space of possibles as an idea is because it takes us to questions of practice and to the questions of the habitus. Okay? And they're the things that particularly interest me. I'm particularly interested in habitus. Now, Bourdieu uses this little kind of formula here, which basically says habitus and capital plus field equals practice. Or as Maitland kind of glosses it, practice results from relations between one's disposition for habitus, one's position in the field, capital, with the current state of play of that social arena, field. So it's a dynamic process, and practices come out of that dynamic set of relationships. So, habitus, what's the heading? So habitus, it's not an original Bourdieusian idea. He actually gets it from Aristotle and from Mauss. Various other writers have actually used the idea of the habitus, but he does something different with it. So for other people, it's just a kind of a descriptive category referring to ways of doing stuff. For Bourdieu, it's a more critical category to think about the wellspring of action. So the habitus is a system of durable, transposable dispositions which function as a generative basis of structured and objectively unified practices. Okay? And you may have come across the famous quote, which I haven't got here, about habitus as being a structured structure and a structuring structure. Okay, well, if you haven't, we won't go there. But again, what he wants to do with habitus, because habitus basically can't quite see the heading, it mediates structure and agency. That was the central concern of his idea of practice theory. Habitus mediates structure and agency. So, so he says the schemes of the habitus owe this efficacy to the fact that they function below the level of consciousness. That's a really important idea for Bourdieu. I think it's a problem, but I'll come back to that later. So we form a habitus in relationship to a field, and we can operate, we act on the basis of most of those aspects of our dispositions being below the level of consciousness. And they're realised as techniques of the body. So again, go back to that professorial professor, most professorial professor you know, in the way that they carry their body as a kind of a series of techniques which capture habitus as a form of embodied cultural capital. So that obviously embodied cultural capital and habitus are pretty the same thing, but looking at it from slightly different perspectives. And so in those techniques of the body, what he says is the visions of the world are built into them. So the working class person acts like a working class person, and the owner of enormous amounts of economic capital who operates as though they own the world. That comes through in the way they perceive, and act and understand the area. So he sees habitus as a matrix of perceptions and appreciations in action. So it's cognitive and phenomenological in the sense that it's about corporeal action. Okay. And again, this idea of habitus, the way he develops it, comes out of his research in 3 areas, okay, of particular communities going through enormous change and the effect that has on their experiences of the world. So Algerian peasants, Bien peasants, the world that he comes from, and his own experience of and his schooling experience, his discussion of schooling in post-war France, but also his own experience of moving into academia. He talks about in terms of how he felt out of place in terms of the lofty scholasticism of French universities with their particular manners and styles of acting. He actually talks about himself having what he called a cleft habitus, a torn habitus, because he inhabited 2 worlds. Okay. So, but remember again, habitus is not a reality, it's a theory trying to describe the wellsprings of human action, human practice. Okay, now where that takes us is to his arguments about practice. This is where it becomes really important to actually understand the dynamism and that is what Bourdieu is trying to do. So sometimes a habitus is seen as a kind of a reified category. Oh, you've got a working class habitus. That means you'll never do well in school. But it doesn't mean it in that kind of iron cagey kind of way. He's trying to explain what people do, not simply how people get distributed into social positions. Okay, so he has this kind of his approach to practice, the theory of practice. He spends a lot of time talking about the practical mastery of the everyday games of sociability, how people operate and perform in the world, and how it requires certain types of mastery. He refers to practical sense, the sense pratique, or the feel for the game. Okay, and he insists that the habitus is not some abstraction determined by structure, but it's constituted in practice and is always oriented towards practical functions. This idea of habitus does a couple of things. Okay, as I said, he's trying to kind of resolve a way of thinking about the relationship between the structure and agency that doesn't fall into the traps of either subjectivism or objectivism. So the habitus is conditioned by the social world that we are socialised into, particularly through family socialisation, but it becomes the basis of our actions through which we shape the world. Okay? So it's a kind of a dialect, if you want to put it that way. So he does this, and in spelling this out, he does a couple of things. So he talks about the shift from rule to strategy. In other words, life is not conducted as though it's obeying a series of rules. Our action is strategic. And by strategic, he doesn't mean a calculation of what is strategic. He means our body is predisposed towards acting in particular ways which are efficacious in a particular place. Okay? So the game is a useful metaphor because he talks about if you take something like soccer, football, okay, the way we operate in a game of soccer is you don't stop and think about every move you make. The ball comes to you, you either run with it, or you kick it to somebody else, or you try and defend it from the person who's coming towards you. But there's no rational calculation. No one stops and thinks, what should I do now? You have to act quickly. So the body has been socialised in a particular way to develop competencies that work most effectively, or don't, in that particular space. The body is also socialised to kind of act as though things like lines on the ground mean something. I can't go over that line, I'll be out of the field. Or the invisible line, I can't go past that player because I'll be offside. So, but these are not all conscious decisions. These are unconscious forms of performative competencies which allow us to play the game. So he says that social life is like that. We have a feel for the game, okay? We go into a pub. I know not to say in that pub in Everton, hey, everybody, I know all the works of Shakespeare. I know not to do that. I work out what's the appropriate behaviour in a particular place without even having to think about it. So the unconscious dimension of habitus is very important, and it's realised as a set of dispositions. We are disposed to work or act in a particular way in given circumstances. So kids who go to school, kids who are successful are disposed to act, to certain things like concentration, bodily discipline, and so on and so forth. So the habitus is a system of dispositions that are designed to develop a formative competence in a particular context. Okay. Also central to this argument is that the habitus reflects what he calls illusio, okay, which is the investment that we have in that particular game or world. Okay? So you don't play soccer, by and large, without caring about it. You play it with passion, as though it really matters in the world. So you go into politics, as though it really matters in the world. So illusio is that kind of interest or investment that we have in the space that we're operating. Secondly, though, it has this notion of doxa, which is the taken for granted views of the world. So built into any particular kind of field, space, particular understandings about how the world operates, which we internalise and take for granted. Okay, so we take for granted that boys and girls are different, or that we should respect our elders, or that we should not cross a street unless there's a green light. So built into that kind of taken for granted views of the world is that kind of reproduction of views which sustain the nature of the world as it is. So you can see how he's trying to use these terms to kind of negotiate the question of power with the question of agency. But again, there are a bunch of interesting questions that kind of come from it. And Bourdieu himself kind of grapples with these. The first is whether we see habitus as inert, because often he talks about it as though it propels us to do something. We accept our fate, amor fati. We accept our fate through the habitus. Okay? And so it feels like it's pretty inert. And yet he has other ways of thinking about the habitus which engage much more with change. So he, in fact, also kind of grapples with the extent to which the habitus, because it's highly socialised and unconscious set of competencies, is inert, relatively static, or whether the extent to which it's flexible and dynamic. So he has a kind of series of works where he kind of grapples with aspects of this. The most interesting one is his arguments around hysteresis, but he only actually refers to these things briefly, like a paragraph here again. By hysteresis, he means that there's often a lag or a mismatch between the habitus and the field. So think the migrant. The migrant who finds himself in a new place, there's a mismatch. Or think about he talks, for example, about peasants in France who grow up in a particular kind of social structure. The world is changing, their habitus no longer fits because there's a lag. And so those lags and mismatches require that the body changes, the habitus changes, or it doesn't, and you can stay with that problem. But Bourdieu himself kind of grapples with this inert and reproductive idea of habitus versus the dynamic, changeable view of habitus. He also grapples with this, with whether it's a unitary thing. He often talks about it, and other people do too, as though it's a simple thing. Yes, that's a habitus. But he primarily talks about it as a system of dispositions. It's a whole range of things. How you eat, how you kind of do your schoolwork, how you dance, and so on and so forth. So in some places, it sounds like he's talking about being unitary, but other places he kind of corrects himself actually and says it's not necessarily unitary, but it's unifying, it's synthesizing. The habitus actually tries to pull things together to make them fit, even if that doesn't always work. So that's one kind of interesting problem for us. The second one is that, and a related one, is that we have a proliferation of habitus. And by that I mean, if you go back to the idea of fields, that we have lots of fields, And if the habitus is related to the field, then we have lots of habitus. And there's going to be tensions between those habitus. So he talks about it in relation to himself as having a cleft habitus, as being torn between the ways he was socialised as a kid and the expectations of French academic life. So he actually talks about himself as inhabiting a habitus which involves a tension between contraries, never resolved into a harmonious synthesis. But he doesn't talk about that by and large in relationship to most other people. So, and like capital and field, it's often been badly used by other scholars who drop out Bourdieu's critical dimensions and just attach habitus to everything, like the examination habitus or the assessment habitus, which kind of is divorced from the arguments around field and capital. So the way I like to explain it is that when we use something before the notion of habitus, we're talking about a quality of habitus, not a type. So when people refer to a working class habitus, I think a better way of thinking about that is to talk about a classed habitus. And a habitus has been shaped by the things that were kind of summarised by the term class. So it's not putting people into kind of pigeonholes, working class habitus, middle class habitus, ruling class habitus. It's saying that one's habitus as a system of dispositions is shaped by our experiences of the thing that we call class. And that's, again, it's kind of an interesting problem when you start thinking about what we now call intersectionality. What happens when we talk about class, and gender, and race, and so on and so forth. And I won't talk about consciousness, but if you're interested in how habitus actually can involve questions of consciousness, Megan Watkins and I wrote an article 20 years ago called How Did Bourdieu Learn to Play Tennis, which we grapple with that. Because Bourdieu is so insistent on the subconscious or the unconscious nature of habitus, he kind of forgets about other things. But I think it's a really interesting thing in the way actually we all involve forms of consciousness when we are doing certain types of things. So tennis, you actually have to stop and think about the shot, or somebody tells you stop and think about your shot. But Bourdieu is not interested in that. Anyway, so we get a series of problems that arise. So I'll start to move towards the conclusion. I want to kind of make a funny point about Bourdieu, because I've treated him as though he was a theorist. And as I said at the beginning, he doesn't see himself as a theorist. So there's a whole bunch of quotes there where he says, let me say, I never theorize, okay? I am engaging in empirical work, and theory emerges only as tools for making sense of the empirical data. It's odd because there are large chunks of Bourdieu when you read him, and it's just read like theory to me. Yeah? Quite dense theory. But he is insistent that his development of these tools comes out of and is developed through his engagement with empirical work. Okay? And he gives a name at one particular point to what he says he's doing. He calls it genetic structuralism. Actually, there's a whole bunch of other terms like structural objectivism, no, structural constructionism, and constructivist structuralism. And he just plays games. He's saying, I'm not one or the other. I'm not on your team, and I'm not on their team. I'm my own man. But he's very insistent that theory has to be about the empirical work that you're doing. Okay? And as he said in that last quote, so these conceptual tools are not ideas as such, they're methods. They're methods of asking questions, doing particular kinds of things with your empirical data. My method is a manner of asking questions. Now that's different to the way we approach theory as students. We look for the theorist, we read their theory and think, oh, he's a clever guy, I better use that. He knows what he's talking about. Okay, so Bourdieu used this, I'll whack it over here. That's not what he actually intended by his own theoretical enterprise. So he would like people, he would like people to actually use their tools that he's developed critically. That's not to say that you can do anything with them. A lot of people use them quite badly. taking this on that. But I think it's really important to bear in mind that theory is a way of asking questions, organising your data, and trying to make sense of it. It's not reality, it's not the truth. So, to conclude, as I've just suggested, Bourdieu is useful not because he gives us answers, but because he asks us really good questions. Okay? And he offers some way of thinking about them. And most importantly, he challenges the assumptions that we make about the world and how we construct it. He's very, very critical of substantialism, okay, by which he means when we use tools as though they are the reality that we're describing. He's very critical of what he calls the scholastic fallacy, which where he says academics who have developed an idea about the world think it's the way real people think about the world. That people don't operate the way scholars do, make sense of the world. So he's very, very conscious of the fact that he's an academic doing analysis in a particular way, and there's a lot of heuristic tools. So my point is not actually to try and indoctrinate you, as I said. It's really about using Bourdieu to ask really good questions and to develop ways of thinking about your data that draw out interesting aspects of the world that you're investing, rather than to fit your data into the categories that somebody like Bourdieu is in. Now, for me, I really like Bourdieu's research. I didn't like it when I first started reading him in the 1980s. It took me a long time to decide that it was actually useful. That's still found really irritating. But I find him useful now because he keeps coming back to particular kinds of questions, like how do we represent the space of a particular social world rather than take it for granted? How do we analyse the structuring, the boundaries of that space? I was talking about before in terms of field. How do we analyse what counts in a particular space? What are the resources actors are drawing on, the sources of authority, particular ways of thinking? Okay, and they're particularly important for me. So this is where I was going to go to spend a lot of time talking about my empirical interests, but I won't. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. The first one is, for me, Bourdieu raises particular kinds of empirical problems, not theoretical ones, empirical problems. What I call, the first one is the pedagogical imperative. So every time I read Bourdieu, I keep thinking, yeah, but you haven't told us, how does somebody acquire that capacity? Where do they acquire it? How well do they acquire it? Who's teaching them? Where do they get to use it? So the problem of acquisition, or what I call pedagogy, is really crucial because he glosses these as things like family socialisation, okay? But rarely does he actually unpack that. And he doesn't actually research family socialisation in any sustained way. He talks constantly about the importance of the family as being the primary form of socialisation, as the primary place where we acquire the competencies that allow us to function in the world, but he doesn't actually research it. And that to me is kind of a messy link. So, you know, one of the things that I did some years ago was I decided to write about my son and talked about, made a link between how he started twiddling with knobs, the musical stereo system in the back room, and how that led to an interest in doors, and how the interest in doors led to, you know, his interest in exploring the outside world. And we explored the outside world through first, you know, taking the tram around the walk, and then around the street, and then walking around the street with him, hand by hand, and then he would walk to school with him, and then he would walk to school on his own, and then by the time he's in his early teens, he goes off on his own. So to me, the bodily competences for being able to navigate a social space are really complicated empirical questions. Okay? As I said, that's the pedagogical imperative, to ask how people acquire stuff. And it's particularly important when we think about the migrant experience. And so I was going to spend, there was a second one, I was going to spend a lot of time talking about the research I've been doing with Lebanese communities in Sydney and practices of settlement. And I'll give you a snippet about insofar as the migrant is a kind of really interesting example of what happens to the body. As I said before, when you migrate, you come to a different social world and your body is out of place. You have to learn to do things differently. You are now living in a world where the smells are different, colours are different, vegetation is different, people act differently. There are all sorts of things that you have to kind of learn. Okay, and so I wrote this piece, not using Bourdieu, many years ago, called Learning to be Lebanese. And the argument goes like something like this. So when a migrant arrives, the first thing they learn is that, gee, Australia's a really different place. Second thing they learn fairly quickly is, wait a minute, I'm the difference. I'm the thing that's different here. Okay? The third thing they learn is that actually I'm living in a place with lots of differences. It's not just me and Australians, because Australians are all sorts of things. And then the fourth thing they learn is that when they go back to the homeland, they're actually different to what people in the homeland are like. And then the fifth thing they learn is that their kids are different to them. So learning to be Lebanese actually is learning to grapple with a whole bunch of differences. And that's a pedagogical experience. And so there are lots of examples where we talk to people. The guy says, oh, I put the train into town, came out into George Street and was completely flummoxed because it didn't look anything like Beirut or wherever he came from. And this man came up to me and said, you're obviously confused. Let me tell you how things operate here. You've got to walk on the left-hand side of the road, okay? You've got to wait for the pedestrian crossing to tell you to cross. It's not like Beirut, it's very, very different. So this guy kind of goes through how you've got to operate differently. And another guy talks about how he was walking with his mate to the Tate College and he grabbed his hand because it's quite a conventional thing to do if you're from particular cultures. And his mate said, don't do that. Don't do that. I think we're homosexual. Okay? So all these little social mores, phenomenological experience are actually pedagogical processes whereby one learns to find themselves at home in some form or other in the new place. Okay? For me, those kinds of examples tell us that actually Bourdieu gives us some interesting thinking tools for doing that. And I'll leave it there. Okay, now, the guitars in Jersey are also cultural capital, but not in a way that Bourdieu would have recognised in the 1960s. But what kind of cultural capital are they? So you know how I gave you that example of the rich guy who buys lots of books, look like he's got lots of cultural capital? I can't play guitar for it's the appropriate euphemism. I'm not very good. Okay, so I've got two guitars. Every now and then I strum and think, I just give up. But I'd love to have them there. So it's cultural capital, but it's not very deep. It's not embodied. But people come into my room and say, oh, gee, I like this guitar. So I get something out of it. I get a profit from it. But whereas the books, I can go and take a book off the shelf and say, yes, this is the famous book by Foucault where he does this. Okay. And the Jersey, yes, that's also a form. It's a cultural good that raises a form of cultural value at the moment. Not a very prestigious form of cultural capital at all, to say. If you know rugby league, you know why.
So what do you make of this in Zoom, since we are in Zoom also? People started having this bookcases as backdrops, and everybody started having this, bookcases as backdrops to, especially, having any conversation or having training or anything. And that's a kind of, because since you're saying that a bookcase, but also the quality of books matters. And, it's not just having books of any kind or a rich guy buying some books. And
it's an old thing, buying books to look impressive.
Yeah.
In fact, what novel was I reading fairly recently? Set in the 19th century, where they actually had bought fake books. So a massive kind of bookshelf of fake books. I've just covered this, they weren't their actual books. But it gave you the sense of having a really good library. But When you say people, which people?
All kinds. I saw all kinds. Well, whenever I was in Zoom, I think most definitely professors showed up there. But then I saw people who were not related to academia also showing off their bookcases more than anything else, and otherwise blurring the background. But bookcases were like prominently. Yeah, so that's something, I don't know what's related to Zoom or whatever.
I mean, you don't need Bourdieu to talk about the cultural value of symbolic value of cultural goods. There are a lot of people who do it, a lot of anthropologists who do it, a lot of sociologists of consumption do it. And the way people use cultural goods to present a particular kind of image of themselves. For Bourdieu, of course, though, it relates to a particular field. So I doubt whether there'd be so many working class people who would use lots of books, unless they were aspirational. So, but the way I would look at it is that we didn't get onto this. So Bourdieu talks about positions in a field, but he also talks about position taking. And so one of the things that we do is we take positions. We do that through forms of expression, through things like cultural goods. Or we say, oh, did you see the latest film at the Dendy this week? Oh, you don't go to Newtown to see movies, okay. So we use goods as a form of cultural exchange, which is a form of position taking. So, you know, Bourdieu's terms, we get a profit from people thinking that we are smart or cultured or whatever. I like the idea of position taking because it simply means that there's a kind of bit of movability in the way we use goods. I was going to say something else there about the role of goods that's just popped out of my head. It'll come back to me in a second. But the thing about the books, I can't think what I was going to say to you, but the thing about the books is that they're not just about looking studious, intelligent, smart, they're also about looking professional, which is a slightly different logic to use Bourdieu's term. So in the same way that somebody put on a shirt, if you're in a meeting, even though you might be wearing boxers, if I'm on Zoom, I don't want you to have this thought in your head too much, but if I'm on Zoom, and I'm wearing a shirt, I'm probably wearing boxers. So it's about looking professional. So it could be that books are also there to say, I'm in my workspace, I'm doing the work that I'm expected to do, I'm not slacking on. So there's a different kind of mode of using the cultural value of books to express something.
And also that working class people actually don't use Zoom. If you really think about it, I mean, Zoom is broadly middle class people doing remote work who can afford to do remote work, or remote study or whatever, you know, remote learning or remote work. Right? Working class people have to be physically present in there.
Isn't that partly because you have a university subscription and so on to Zoom? I mean, I understand for Zoom, if you don't have an institutional subscription, it's expensive. You're limited to kind of 45-minute meeting. But I would imagine most regular people would use Skype, or I would use Skype to communicate with my family and my parents. And my experiences in Cambodia is that Skype is just the ubiquitous communication tool, even or Facebook Messenger now. So there's a different functionality, I think, that the kind of way Zoom is actually made available is as much the issue, I think, as a middle class identification product. It has a certain utility, and that will be, I guess, built into the design and audio. We have much to say about the way Zoom's designed for specific purposes.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, Bourdieu is mostly interested in the top end of cultural hierarchies. So he doesn't talk a lot about certain spaces that we might think are interesting for different kinds of subfields, you know. And I think music is a really good example. So one of the criticisms that we got for the Australian Cultural Fields book from a guy up at Newcastle was that we don't look at any of the subfields of music that young people listen to. And there's a good methodological reason for that, because if you're trying to map a social space, you've got to have items that have a wide variety of options. Okay, so most people will have heard of Mozart, you know, they don't like, but not many people will have heard of, you know, the latest post-punk band from Newcastle suburbs. So if you have that item there in the survey, and you've got one person that picks it, then statistically it's not very useful. So there's a methodological problem built into the work of trying to map hierarchies, cultural hierarchies in the fields.
One more thing that when I was reading about capital, and Modu says, I think somewhere at the start that capital is almost like a Marxist accumulated labor. Is he using that in that sense, or is it using that labor time thing that you're saying? I was a bit confused for a second there, because you're saying it's also social energy. Capital, social energy. So
that's a good question, actually. He has a very ambiguous relationship with Marx. He doesn't like Marxism. So people often talk about whether he's a Marxist or not. And he actually has a comment somewhere, I can't remember where it was, maybe in the sketch, where he says something like Marx was not as Marxist as the Marxists today. And so in the 1950s, you know, he was dealing with all these people that saw themselves as Marxists, and much more Marxist than Marx was. So he's obviously read Marx and taken on board those arguments about the accumulation of labour. But in fact, that kind of argument comes from Hegel. Marx takes it from Hegel.
yeah, dialectics.
Yeah, so there's a tradition of looking at the way human practices forms of accumulated labour, and that process of internalisation through labour. I think it's a tradition he's borrowing from. He's very critical of the Marxist approach to class. As I said, he does use the term class, unless he thinks about it and says, I don't use the term class. But what he's critical of Marxism for is what he refers to as substantialism, that classes really do exist. And he says, no, class is the name that we give to the objective circumstances that produce the thing we call class. And it sounds like a little bit of academic-y, you know, wanky kind of, you know, blah, blah, blah. But he's kind of keeps insisting that when we use terms like class, that not terms that people don't necessarily use themselves, we're talking about a kind of theory about the social conditions in which people produce their being.
Is there some resonance with what Catherine would have written about the classes process?
Yeah.
One way to
But more importantly for Bourdieu, class is relational. But it's not relational in the Marxist sense, in the sense that so Marxism has a tradition of talking about the struggle between the working class and the ruling class. Okay? It doesn't mean that kind of relation. It means that like I was saying before about the field, is that we're all in this kind of dynamic relationship of relations to each other. And everything, something here shifts, something here shifts. And the class is kind of an aggregation of a particular space in what he calls the social space.
And it's not economically structured. The class is not, like in the Marxist sense, it's not primarily economic.
No. And there are bits of Marx that would agree with that. And a lot of Marxists have taken on board his arguments in cultural sociology to argue different course.
Yeah.
But in terms of a kind of a conventional, traditional view of Marxist view of class reproduces, Bourdieu is very much against that.
And what do you think about the reproduction or the production of elite in terms of cultural capital?
Sorry, say that again?
The production of elites using cultural capital, because you were saying that economic capital and cultural capital are related, but are different axes of power. And so there's no one-to-one relation. And but I'm feeling that cultural capital plus economic capital is necessary for the production of an elite.
There's some people that would argue that Bourdieu is very much in a Weberian tradition, which sees social stratification more like questions of status and elites. Bourdieu doesn't ever kind of come out and say he's a Weberian, but there are places where he does talk about elites. So for Bourdieu, it's all about, so where are you talking about? Who are you talking about? So, he has a lot of discussion of the religious field in some places, where we're clearly not talking about classes, we're talking about things like elites. And the distribution of religious capital produces particular kinds of relations. And I only use the economic thing because it's the first cut of the data. But that he would actually, so he uses the language of dominant and dominated. So, and you can also have a dominated fraction of a dominant class. Okay, so that's where things like what you would be calling elites come into play. So it's all about relations within an aggregation. And there are different kinds of levels of power. Where he most specifically, I think, talks about elites within state nobility, where he talks about elite private schooling in France and how it produces the people who govern France in the future. He does use a language of class there, but I think he's much more interested in thinking it outside simple class terms, thinking about it in more in terms of the dominant fraction of the dominant class, dominated fraction of the dominant class.
What I was trying to think is that the way we talk upper class today, often you can't be a member of an upper class by just having economic capital. You have to have some cultural capital too, isn't it? I mean, you can't become, you not become a member of an upper class just because you're rich.
No, but bearing in mind that it's a field that's very complicated. That's why he talks about volume and composition. But I'll give you an anecdotal example of it. A guy I had a chat to about 25 years ago, maybe, who was a guy who made a lot of money very quickly, working in the markets. And the markets is very much a cash economy. And he came from a migrant background. And he was complaining about the fact that the school that he was sending his kids to weren't teaching his kids to read properly. And so he didn't finish school. We said, don't you read to your kid at home? No. He said, no, I don't read. So he was quite rich. I mean, he wasn't a billionaire, but he was certainly very wealthy, and he had economic capital. He had cultural capital in the sense of he had a big house. But in terms of the kinds of things we're talking about, the cultural goods around books and so on, investment literacy, he thought that he could buy the school that would give his kids the cultural capital they needed without him actually having to do the labour. So, but that's kind of a rare thing. And typically what happens is if, it's kind of like the bourgeoisie of the 19th century in England. So when you made a lot of money, you bought a landed estate, so you looked like the gentry or the aristocracy. You bought big libraries, big houses, filled them with the best things. So you bought the cultural capital, and then the second generation kind of grows into it. And there's a bit of that that goes on now. So he may not, this guy that I'm referring to, he may not have finished school, not interested in reading books, but you can sure bet that he'll make sure that his kids go to university and they'll get a credential, even if they go back in business. So there is a very complicated relationship, and it's about volumes and composition. So, I'm wondering if Bourdieu considered the body as part of one's capital. Yes. While I understand that in Bourdieu discussed masculine domination, I'm curious about how he viewed the body itself. For instance, an able-bodied person may have greater access to opportunities and face less stigma, among other advantages. I can't answer what he would have said about the second half of the question, but it's clear that Bourdieu is thinking very much in terms of embodied competencies in a very profound sense. So, like the quote I gave you about the way you eat, or so on and so forth. Bourdieu is interesting in that he's very much shaped by phenomenology, the work of people like Merleau-Ponty, to some extent Husserl and Heidegger, but he also rails against it because he's not interested in having that such a limited phenomenological scope. So he's interested in corporeality insofar as it positions people in the social world. So what he doesn't talk about, able-bodied versus disabled bodies, or whatever how you want to characterise it, he is interested in the very embodied nature. So that's why I talk about embodied cultural capital as being distinct from cultural goods. And the way embodied capital and habits are pretty well much the same thing, but viewed from slightly different perspectives. I don't think he ever talks about I mean, the thing that springs to mind is when he talks about the peasant habitus, which is a different question, but it's interesting because he talks about, so in the French system, if you're a second son, agricultural system, if you're the agricultural society, you've got the second son, you don't inherit the land, so you have no value in the marriage market. And so he talks about the bachelor's ball, it's called the bachelor's ball, and all these male peasants turn up, but they just stand around the edges, and they are useless because no one's interested in them, because they're not a marriage prospect. But the way he talks about it, it's a very visceral experience of shame and incompetence. It's nothing to do with they can. They're good workers, but because they haven't got the capital, because they're not the first son, they are a useless body. And he talks about this one example where a woman feels sorry for one of the guys and kind of goes up and asks him to dance, but I think he refuses because he's just so ashamed of his inability. And it's a very, very visceral kind of experience. But I'm sure somebody has applied Bourdieu to these questions, and you would probably know that better than me. Maybe Jared Galton. Has he ever talked about his Bourdieu? Or yeah, but a good question.
Thank you.
I was going to ask you, the correspondent analysis, did you say that term again?
Multiple correspondence analysis.
Multiple correspondent analysis. So that made me think of the Facebook pixel as kind of an example of how that's applied in digital spaces, and that it's the same thing. It's like, this person like this, or you look at it, so they use it as kind of advertising tool to help you, be selling a product or service. And I just thought right away, like that's exactly what that was.
Yeah.
So that graph and talked about kind of how they come to those.
I wouldn't be surprised if there are French marketing companies that have used multiple correspondence analysis in their work, but because it generates some really interesting data, even though the data is an artifact of the methodology, it's not reality. But so we used it in the Australian Cultural Fields Project. And it does a couple of, because it distributes people according to the likeness of their tastes. It produces particular kinds of what we call clusters. Okay? So clusters aren't classes in that classical Marxist sense. Clusters might be generated by a whole range of things. So in the analysis that we did across the fields, what we would call social class was a significant aspect in some of those fields. Education was a more significant factor in some of those fields, and gender was a really important factor in some of those fields. So I think, I might be wrong, but I think gender gender and education were much more significant in say the literary field, people's patterns of literary consumption. Gender has a much more significant impact than class per se. And so if you look at clusters, you get different aggregations of people, which make you think differently about the way people consume and the kinds of demographics that go into producing patterns of consumption, which would lead you to kind of a marketing person from that history.
Just curious, did you guys look at political orientation?
Bourdieu does, yes. So in Distinction, he has a whole chapter about political orientations, and we feed off that in one of the chapters in Australian Cultural Fields. We feed off a bit of that, just really what's interesting to say about that. Not a lot. I mean, it's primarily for him. Politics is primarily in terms of French political parties in the 1960s. So I don't know how you can kind of translate that into any contemporary discourse, even in France. It doesn't quite make sense. But again, it produces much more interesting kind of connections between one's voting tendencies and one's political views, because they also ask about people's attitudes to particular politicians and contemporary issues. I just can't remember them. It obviously connects strongly with class, but not in this simple way. And again, the politics of middle class people with high volumes of cultural capital is not the same as the political views of middle class people with high volumes of economic capital. Slight divergence here.
Out of interest, did Bourdieu ever say much about entrepreneurship? Do you have any comments on that in terms of, I'm thinking more about embodiment and kind of visceral registers that are involved in people who have to adapt to changing fields. So you're talking about this concept of viscerous, where the field changes and people have to with body changes accordingly, their sensory environment changes. And when we research entrepreneurship, we're very much looking at their responses to changing environments all the time, and that can be at many different levels. I mean, in Cambodia, I researched with entrepreneurs who are not entrepreneurs with choice. You know, they're the poorest of the poor. They're not rich entrepreneurial people. They're entrepreneurs because they have to survive, and that's a very visceral thing, I imagine. But I just wondered, out of curiosity, if Bourdieu ever commented on that, or have you ever seen any other works applying the Bourdieuan lens to?
No, not off the top of my head. I can't think of anything. But I'm interested in something which is not a million miles from that. So I've been interested in, been doing a little bit of research in southwestern Sydney around Bankstown. And there's a kind of a creation of a scene in Bankstown, which is partly shaped by entrepreneurs, although we've only managed to speak to one entrepreneur so far. Entrepreneurs don't like to talk to people, academics. But that scene is kind of interesting because so one of the things that happens in any kind of suburb that's shaped by peer spot communities is that there's an absence of things that people want that relate to their homeland. So entrepreneurs spring up and provide those services. Okay, so it's a supermarket that now sells the goods, the spices, and so on that you couldn't get in Coles or Woolies. Okay, and that also happens in the cultural realm. So entrepreneurs have sprung up and started bringing acts from the Middle East. But a couple of things that are interesting about that, not that it's about embodied as such, except that it makes people, migrants who felt out of place, makes them feel more at home when that kind of entrepreneurial activity occurs, because they get the smells and the services that they want. But what was interesting to me was that so it's like the tension between the habitus as inert, that you kind of make home by bringing things from home there, But by bringing them to this new place, it changes things. So rather than make your own bread at home, you now buy Lebanese bread from the supermarket. Okay? And rather than listen to the local people who play music and dance in your village, you go and buy a ticket to watch an act that's come from a country that's next to, but not quite your homeland. So the service is kind of near enough, it's good enough kind of thing. So something happens in the experience of being at home and the migrants' experience of the diaspora, which is both a product of the degree of inertia that happens and the way that things have to be refracted through what's available here.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a kind of bricolage.
It's kind of bricolage, yeah, making do. Okay, and so that you've got you know the entrepreneur who brings these acts from not Lebanon but close enough to it, but then you've got the local. Often second generation Arabic speaking people who established their own Arab theatre, which is not brought from the homeland, it's an appropriation of a particular kind of governmental facility or service. You know, government here supports provisions, particular kinds of ethnic community activities. So you make use of that, you set up a theatre or whatever. So that what you end up, so what happens is that you end up with kind of a diasporic community, which is never, ever a simple transplanting of the thing that came from the homeland. And yet we often talk about it as though it's a simple transplanting from the homeland. And this is part of the problem with the way questions of ethnicity is treated in Australia. You go, oh yeah, you go to Bankstown, the Lebanese have taken over, they just do all things their own way. But in fact, it's a very kind of complicated process of settlement, which involves transplanting, appropriation, reconfiguring, and so on and so forth. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do. And I mean, just on that, one of the things I'd say that I've always found with Bourdieu is that I find his notions much more useful than conventional notions of identity. So we live in a kind of a realm associated cultural theory where we love the category of identity, but it's such a one-dimensional, shallow concept that I think it's actually very useful. So what identity kind of points to is the way people identify. And that's fine, but identity is not reality. It's a way people identify. And so by Bourdieu talking about particular kinds of practices of embodied practices and how they relate to competence in a particular realm and its relationship to cultural capital and social capital, I think those questions around identity and belonging become much more interesting than the language of identity and belonging.
I mean, in the work we're doing with Heather around mobile phones and digital finance, I imagine that mobilising Bourdieu will be a very good way to understand the subject positions as they navigate these devices, or aspirational middle class people who now use digital financial products that are more targeted at them than farmers, basically being anyone other than a farmer, by being able to navigate a mobile device and access digital services on the phone. I guess will have a certain field of its own, but the thing I'm finding of interest there is that the young people who are using these devices then transfer that to their parents. So I mean, it's a kind of counterintuitive thing when you were saying, you know, man who becomes an entrepreneur is making sure his children get educated, but with the dissemination of mobile technologies, I'm finding it's almost the reverse of that. It goes from younger to older generation.
That's right. So the kind of the classic idea that we have a family socialization, parents raise kids to act and do and be and think in some particular ways, is, as you say, it's turned on its head. And there's always an element of that. But I think digital realm manifests in a degree of intensity that we don't probably haven't quite experienced before.
Yeah, my research is actually proving that it's always the children in the family trying to do platform stuff.
So is this a continuing class or is it going to start?
It's going to finish in about,
Okay, cool, never mind.
About now.
Oh, yeah, fine, that's fine. Don't mind me.
okay. But so for me, again, it comes back to what I call the pedagogical imperative. How do people acquire these things? And what the interesting things that happen when relations, pedagogical relations between parent and child are reversed or changed. You know, having watched my partner, who some of you know, who's not very technologically competent. She's not here, so I can say that. Trying to teach her mother, her 96-year-old mother, how to use things like mobile phones and Zoom. It's kind of interesting process. And our 26-year-old son, he just kind of steps in and refuses to teach. He just thinks it's a pointless activity. He just doesn't. Okay, so there's this kind of weird kind of thing happening with pedagogical relationship between grandchild, parent, and grandparent. And to me, Bourdieu's model he's never really kind of grappling with that kind of stuff, even though I think it's actually should be central to his arguments about family socialisation, what he calls the primary happiness. I mean, grandparents and the role in children's upbringing has always been crucial. He doesn't go there. So shall we leave it there? Well, thank you very much for coming along, and I hope you've got a few things to think about. Apart from, well, that's why I'm not using Bourdieu. See you guys.
Thanks, Greg.
Oh, should we wait a minute? Don't wait at the computer screen. So there you go. There's something about the digital world that old people look at computer screens rather than the camera.
Very well. This is as an aside. You started talking about some of the reasons why what is important. I kind of got volume of scholastic output and some interesting ideas. Anything else? Like, is there anything? Because it seems like like one of the key people is like, is there anything I'm missing?
No, those, I mean, the reference citations thing is kind of partly tongue in cheek because it's playing the academic game that he would say is important in the field. It's mostly, I mean, if you look at the way people have taken up ideas of cultural capital in particular, field and habitus also, and some other ideas, symbolic violence, which we didn't talk about today, they're pervasive throughout the social science.
Adoption. It's not just the output, it's how people have absorbed his thinking and made it, they're kind of intertwined it with their own.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine educational research nowadays, in particular, as one particular field, without talking about cultural capital. But the way it's often taken up is quite poor. It's very selective. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, it's pervasive.
Okay, that's thank you. That distinction I was trying to, that makes sense now. That we're talking about kind of citation, because the citation is a metric, right?
Yeah.
Absorption
So yeah,
is being more difficult to quantify, but you can see it, just like kind of culture and so on. So, that's interesting.